You're tuned to More Living with Jim Brogan, broadcasted live from the Brogan Financial Studios at News Talk 98.7, where old-fashioned values, expert knowledge, and genuine understanding come together to give you the retirement straight talk you deserve. Jim's a former National Advisor of the Year recipient and a financial educator, and he's here today to talk about how you can live out the best years of your life. Jim and the Brogan Financial team have been helping retirees and pre-retirees across the Southeast for almost 20 years in their pursuit of financial independence. You can reach them during the week at 865-862-6800. So sit back, relax, and get ready to learn, folks, because More Living with Jim Brogan starts now.
Happy Saturday, East Tennessee, and welcome to More Living with Jim Brogan, where it's all about living the best years of your life your way. You're listening to News Talk 98.7 WOKI, and you know, what is the economic outlook in a post-COVID world and for the next decade? With increased government spending and a large deficit, easy money policy from the Federal Reserve, what is the future of U.S. income taxes? What about inflationary concerns? You know, the economy is showing good signs of recovery, but we certainly have some challenges we're facing. Our guest this morning is Dr. Bill Fox. He's the director of the Boyd Center for Business and Economic Research at the University of Tennessee. He's an expert in public economics and taxation and economic development. He received his Ph.D. in economics from Ohio State University. He's held visiting appointments as professor at the University of Hawaii, scholar at the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City, and distinguished Fulbright chair at the University of Frankfurt, Germany. And he's been a consultant in over 40 countries and 15 U.S. states, and was the chief economist for Governor Haslam. So without further ado, good morning, Dr. Fox. Welcome to More Living.
Good morning. Thank you very much.
It's great to have you on. Thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule.
Sure.
Let's kind of dive into the post-COVID world here. Of course, I guess we're not completely post-COVID, but just overall, with some of the challenges we faced over the past year in the global economy, how do you see things bouncing back over the remainder of 2021?
Well, I think, you know, most people most economists at least, are surprised at how fast we have bounced back. There's been lots of discussion, since COVID started over just how quick, and it's been as fast as I think anybody could have thought, at least as measured by GDP, which is just output in the economy. This quarter, we're in the second quarter of 2021. This quarter, we will reach the same GDP we had before the COVID event, and so really good from a output perspective. From an employment perspective, not so good. We still have about 8 million fewer people working in the U.S. economy, and 100,000 or so fewer working in Tennessee. And so good from one perspective, not as good from others. But as we go through the year, there's so much federal stimulus out there, and monetary policy is so loose that the economy will continue to grow very strongly. And we'll have, just throwing a number out there, something like 6% or over GDP growth, which is extraordinarily fast.
Well, it's really remarkable. I do want to ask you, I want to get into the easy money policy and also the stimulus, federal stimulus. We'll get into all of those things. But first I want to ask you, Dr. Fox, the savings rates in the United States are the highest at any time since shortly after World War II. Is that surprising to you? The savings rates, to me, are pretty remarkable.
That's actually not surprising, because what's happened is, so people's income from employment is off noticeably because of the 8 million job losses, and some people may be earning less than they would have before, and just working less is what I mean by that over the last year. But what didn't happen was a fall in people's income, because the federal government gave many of us so much money through the stimulus payments and through the extra unemployment insurance benefits. A lot of money has been put out there. And here's the thing. When people expect money to continue, they tend to adjust their spending. But when they see it as one-time money, they're much more prone to get their balance sheet in better order. And so they pay off credit card debt. Now, maybe, I know in the early days I was hearing a lot of anecdotes, and I'm talking about a year ago now. I was hearing a lot of anecdotes about, man, this is the first time I had the money to buy a washer and dryer. I'm going to do it. And we got some of that. But now, as this has there have been several of these payments, people are taking that money and effectively saving it. And so what it says to me is there's a lot of smart Americans out there who realize don't change your behavior because government gave you $1,400. Use it as a time to actually make yourself better off, and many people did. And
Sure.
so in fact, if you look at the detail of the analysis on this, if you get an unemployment insurance payment, so this is kind of replacing your work dollars, we see that within maybe 2 months, all of that gets spent. If you get a stimulus payment, it looks like only maybe 15, 20% of it is ever being spent. Within this window we're talking about, as people get their balance sheet in better order. And so it's not surprising, given all this money being put out there, that the saving rate has risen.
So let's dive into what Washington has been doing. And I guess we could go down a rabbit hole here, which I don't want to do as far as, where they're targeting the monies properly, but certainly we've been in dire circumstances, and if you look back at our U.S. history, when there have been dire circumstances, whether it was for war or for economic calamity or a variety of things, the government has stepped in and really helped with stimulus. But our debt is dramatically increasing, and there's no signs that it's going to stop. And there's a lot of concern of everybody I meet with almost weekly, Dr. Fox, about where income taxes may be headed in the future. Once we're through this, on the stimulus part of it and the debt we're accumulating, how do we unwind all this?
Well, of course, there has been stimulus over the last year that's really unprecedented. As you noted, having stimulus is not unprecedented. Having it of the magnitude we have over the last year is unprecedented, both on the monetary side and on the fiscal side. And so, they've appropriated in Congress something like, something over $5 trillion already. And there are a couple of other proposals out there from the president. And so huge amounts of stimulus. Now, not all that money has been spent, and maybe some of it will never be spent, and that's probably a good thing. But, we needed the stimulus, no question about it. I do not object to us doing it. But at some point, we do have to question whether more stimulus is needed. And, but I'll remind you, they're walking this tightrope, this balancing act of saying, okay, we just heard this past week, inflation rates are higher than most people expected, although I don't think it's a serious problem. We may want to come back to that. But inflation rates higher than we might have expected. But we also had fewer jobs created in April than we expected. And so, the economy wasn't quite as strong, again, particularly as I already noted, as measured by employment, as we'd hoped. So a tough balancing act. But let's remember that while we can quibble over the magnitude of the stimulus in 2020 and 2021, and it will continue a bit into 22 and 23 because of the spending of this money, our longer-term house is also out of order. I mean, like it or not, when we cut taxes in 2017, the thing is when you cut taxes, you get less money. It's that simple. Anybody who tells you that cutting taxes more than generates enough revenue is just being dishonest with where the data and analysis is. And so we cut taxes, but we didn't cut spending. And now, as we go forward from here, first of all, we're hearing proposals on the other side of the aisle from let's raise spending without raising taxes, or maybe raising some taxes. But beyond that, the real issue is the population is aging. And I know that's something that you spend much of your life thinking about, but Medicare spending goes up and Social Security spending goes up with this aging population. And so forever, our deficits will be over $1 trillion. That has nothing to do with the stimulus we just did. It has to do with the demographics of our population and the extent to which we're raising tax revenues.
There's a lot to unpack in all that stuff you said, and I want to get into some of those things. We definitely will get into some of the inflationary concerns. I know this week in particular there are real concerns about inflation. Federal Reserve, it continues to indicate they're not concerned about. It's just transient inflation issues. But we have a lot to unpack there, Dr. Fox. We are visiting with Dr. Bill Fox here on More Living with Jim Brogan. We're talking about economics in the United States. We'll also talk about impacts all over the world, so stay with us. You're listening to More Living with Jim Brogan right here on News Talk 98.7 WOKI.
Welcome back to News Talk 98.7's Brogan Financial Studios, where Jim Brogan is coming to you live with important news and advice to help you achieve your dream retirement. Get ready to learn and live. Here's your host, Jim Brogan.
Thanks for tuning in. This is More Living here on News Talk 98.7 WOKI. I'm your host, Jim Brogan. We're visiting with Dr. Bill Fox, economist, and just talking about all the different ramifications of where we are, where we've been, and where we may be heading. Dr. Fox, you know, you touched there on the aging population and the unfunded liabilities that we face with things like Medicare and Social Security, which makes the debt issue one that will continue to increase. What I heard you say in there is trillion-dollar deficits will absolutely be a continued way in the future. And you mentioned the tax cuts of 2017. How likely is it that in the next 5 to 10 years we see a dramatic change in our income tax system?
We can talk about various options. Certainly income or corporate income taxes would be high on the list. I think there was broad agreement on the thinking on the corporate income tax side that corporate taxes should come down. In fact, even in the Obama administration, there was a lot of discussion and emphasis on reducing corporate taxes. Now, they were thinking from 35% federal rate to 28. It went from 35 to 21. And so, the notion that we might end up with a rate that's somewhere between that 28 and 21 rate would seem likely to me over the course of the next decade. I think, again, there will likely be pressure to raise individual income taxes as well. Corporate tax, when it comes right down to it, is not a really big share of our national income taxes. And part of that is because an awful big share of business income no longer arises within the corporate sector. The corporate sector has been shrinking over time as other kinds of business structures have grown in importance. And so what I would expect, again, is a likely some increase in taxes. Now, if of course, as the Democrats have been talking about, if what we do is we raise taxes simply to spend more money, we're, of course, not making any headway on reducing the deficits. And so we can think about taxes to add more programs, or we can think about taxes to cut deficits. And there, which of those two happen, is a political question for sure.
I'd say so. Let's talk about Federal Reserve policy. The Federal Reserve is continuing to promote easy money policy. They're keeping rates very, very low. It seems like inflation down the line. Now, you mentioned you're not as concerned about inflation in the short term. Most economists that I've heard share that agreement. The Federal Reserve has said that. What about in the longer term? Are there some inflationary issues? Can the Federal Reserve unwind some of this easy money policy?
Well, obviously, it's a challenge for them. Let's be honest about that. Again, the fiscal policy increase, all that federal spending, and the loose monetary policy were actually really good policies in 2020, given COVID and the shutdowns that happened in various form or another across our country. So no question of their policy. The issue, just as you noted, is when and how to unwind it. And this is a science. An art. This is not a science. The precision here we have to recognize is loose. And so the question is, will they do it at the right time? And nobody knows with certainty, well, this is the right time. it's going to require very close watching of the data. We heard this week the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, was up 4.2% by comparison with a year ago, which is a bigger growth or a bigger inflation rate than most even economists expected. And so that's a little bit of reason for concern. But remind yourself what was happening a year ago. Airline ticket prices were falling. And just, go through the list of things where prices were going down. And so the fact that we might get some what appears to be inflation, but just temporary, putting back some of those prices where they were. Oil prices a year ago were negative, you might remember, for a brief period of time. And, gasoline was very cheap. And so we're getting, setting aside the crisis of this week on gasoline, we are still putting gasoline prices back closer to where they were pre-pandemic and so forth. And so remember, a lot of what's happening now is clearly temporary. And if the Fed unwinds properly, and again, we don't continue with a significant amount of fiscal policy, then I think this remains just a temporary set of inflation. Now, let me tell you how the Fed is thinking about this. And I'm just basing this on what they've been saying. The first thing they're saying is we want inflation to average 2%. Now, they want it to be positive and like 2%, because if you get prices falling, what happens is people put off spending until the prices are down, and that becomes a self-reinforcing negative impact on the economy. People just don't spend, and we need people to spend. That's the economy grows because you and I go out and spend. That doesn't mean excessive, but right amounts. And so the Fed wants some inflation positive. They've said we want to average 2. Now the thing is, over the last decade, we haven't had 2% inflation. So to average 2, now this is arithmetic. You got to take yourself back to 6th and 7th grade. And we learned there that if we're going to average 2% and we have a whole bunch of below 2s, we got to have some over 2s to average 2. And so the Fed is effectively saying we're okay with seeing a while of higher inflation because they want people's inflation expectation to average 2%. And so they're actually trying to have a credible 2% number. And then a third policy that the Fed has is to have full employment. And so, they're balancing the inflation concerns with making sure that job creation remains underway. And so I'm hopeful. I think there are really quality economists around and advising the Fed and in the Fed. I'm really hopeful that they can pick the right time on it and that they won't let political or other factors keep them from reducing this very, very loose policy. And of course, there's two elements to it. You talked about the low interest rate. The other thing is the Fed is buying massive amounts of securities. And hopefully they'll stop that asset buying relatively soon, even if interest rates remain lower for a significant period of time. And I'll remind you something you clearly know. If interest rates are lower, then federal deficits stay down because they have to pay the interest. As interest rates go up, and that's not really even factored that much into what deficits look like for the next decade. If interest rates go up, then the federal deficit gets that much larger.
Well, and actually, we say there's some. You may disagree with this, but there may be some parallels with the 1950s. Where they kept interest rates, the Fed kept interest rates very, very low and created just a little bit of inflation, but kept those rates low. And of course, the economic outlook was completely different with the budget surpluses we saw with the federal government. But that's where I feel like it can get dangerous, is because they're keeping the rates low, and if inflation starts to creep up and isn't just transient, then does the dam break at some point? Does it put too much pressure? And is that squeezing us? Is that kind of pickpocketing us a little bit?
Well, I mean, again, they've given all kind of income to us, and particularly, of course, if you're a saver in this environment and you're trying to get return to your holdings through the bond markets, to the debt markets, then they've kind of pinched you anyway, right? It's hard to make any money on many of those assets. So it has lots of implications for us as individuals, as well as this broad economy that we're talking about. And so again, the challenge is not that they did the policy, or the issue is not. It's can they time the unwinding of it right? And many people are saying interest rates aren't going to come up for several more years.
Right.
2023 is kind of the range that I see it. But let me just note, by the way, if the financial markets thought that high inflation was a really big issue, I would have expected long interest rates to come up pretty sharply, and they haven't. And so at least so far, the market must believe that the Fed is able to walk this tightrope.
Yes, that is an absolutely great point. Let's talk about the supply chain a bit. There's just been so many things that have happened. You look at housing, building costs in the housing market, the costs in the car market, the chip suppliers from Taiwan had cut production. There's so many industry. I know some people. I have some friends, Dr. Fox, that were remodeling their kitchen, and they couldn't get appliances for like 5 or 6 months. Yeah. And then, of course, a lot of those supply chain issues also make prices go up abruptly. But I would expect that there would be an equilibrium that eventually would return in the supply chain. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I agree with you entirely, and you made the correct point that another part of this temporary inflation is supply chain issues, and the chips are, again, the best example of that, although we can think of gasoline this week as another clear example of that, and the construction industry, and it has caused prices to go up. And so what this tells us is that with all the income that's been provided by the federal government, combined with, the economy recovering, demand has responded more quickly than supply is able to. And I used to talk about this a year ago, what I thought would happen would be even in the fall we'd begin to see the supply chain problems get solved, and they have actually taken a bit longer than I might have anticipated, with just a whole bunch of things going on around the chip industry, and it's not just the demand increases. There've been some production issues and so forth, and so it's a part of the inflation. But I agree with you also that this will tend to correct itself over time. There's money to be made out there. Producers will solve these problems. And of course, we've even had import issues and getting things off of the ships and so forth, particularly out on the West Coast. And so a lot of challenges, but they sort themselves out, and prices will come back down. And as you said, your friends who couldn't get their appliances, and we hear, okay, maybe I can get lumber, but it's really expensive. And I've heard concerns about this from lots of people, and I'm certain it's true. Despite that, interestingly enough, housing starts are the highest level they've been since, now get this, not since like 2018 or something like that, since before the Great Recession, 2006-07. Well, you have to go back to find the kind of housing starts we're having. Wow. So despite this issue of construction prices and so forth, houses are getting built out there.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned the simple issue of supply and demand. My daughter is a sophomore in college at Samford University down in Birmingham, and she's going to be a business major, and probably marketing, although she's thinking about economics now. She took a macroeconomics course this spring. And then my youngest daughter is turning 16, and we're starting to look at cars, and we were talking about, my oldest daughter was home for a week, and we were talking about what's happened in the used car market over the last 3 months because of the supply in the new car market and how much it's gone in. And then my oldest daughter started asking me questions like, now, Daddy, is this because demand is a lot higher than supply right now? And she started asking me all these economic questions, and it was just a
Gary, when your kids start talking back economics to you, right?
It's great. I loved it. And then my 15-year-old started joining in, and she said, Daddy, when do you think an equilibrium will come back and things will be more balanced out between supply and demand? And she's a freshman in high school. It was really cool. Yeah, it was really cool.
So they're understanding exactly the world as we're seeing it right now. These supply chain issues are simply demand coming back more quickly than supply. But guess what? The economy works, and we get to a new equilibrium.
That's exactly right. When we come back from our next break, I do want to get into the energy markets and what's going on there, and also some of the implications of what we're seeing in the vaccine and the treatments of COVID-19. So stay tuned as we're visiting with Dr. Bill Fox. This is More Living with Jim Brogan here on News Talk 98.7 WOKI.
Welcome back to News Talk 98.7's Brogan Financial Studios, where Jim Brogan is coming to you live with important news and advice to help you achieve your dream retirement. Get ready to learn and live. Here's your host, Jim Brogan.
Thanks for tuning in. This is More Living with Jim Brogan, where it's all about living the best years of your life your way. You can catch us every week here on News Talk 98.7 WOKI. We are on at 9 to 10 in the morning. We're also re-air the same show every afternoon at 3 on Saturday. So either 9 a.m. or 3 p.m. We'll also podcast our shows. This show will be up on our website by Monday, Tuesday at the latest, if you missed part of it and want to hear more of our interview with Dr. Bill Fox. Let's talk a little bit about the vaccine production, Dr. Fox. Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca all developed vaccines very quickly and spent millions on their development. What is your opinion of skipping potential patents for COVID vaccines and giving the technology to every country to be able to manufacture their own?
Sure. I don't know that I bring any real expertise to this question. It's a political and sort of very narrowly defined business question. Obviously, patents, if we think about them more broadly, are really important to research and analysis and product development, and so it's clearly something that we want to retain. This is, of course, being talked about in an area, but once you start in one, well, why don't we need vaccine to eliminate patents here, and you just kind of go down the list of things. And of course, there's been much of the discussion about our competition with China over maybe sometimes they're ignored. And so I think it has to be done with great care. At the same time, we can't have a world in which the United States and a couple of other countries get all of the medical care. Let's just talk about it more broadly. While it's not available to needy populations around the world, and so if we're not going to share the patents, then we need another solution to ensure that there's some kind of reasonable equity in availability of health care.
Absolutely. Kind of along those lines, when we look at the emerging markets, what do you see, how do you see things evolving in the emerging markets out of all of this, and what are the potential implications to the developed markets down the line?
Well, let's face it. The EU and the United States, while and the United States more than the EU, are experiencing economic growth. And I'm setting aside COVID here. I'm thinking more longer term now as we think about issues like that. We've had economic growth, but the faster growth in the world is going to be in Asia and in Africa to some extent. We have, much of the EU, for example, has actual population declines. A number of the countries, very slow population expansion. So just think the market is growing more slowly from that side. U.S., you may have heard last week with our 2020 census, population growth in the last decade, the slowest since the 30s, and the 30s is a unique time period. Basically, our population keeps slowing down, and birth rates are incredibly low in the U.S. right now, suggesting that's a problem that's continuing for now. And so if we think about where the markets are going to be, they're going to be in Asia, Africa, faster population growth, and countries that will experience better income growth, in part because they're simply catching up. And their bases are very low, and so getting increases is easy. So we as a country, I think, if we want to maintain good income and economic growth, we need to be able to avail ourselves of those markets. And it's back to the healthcare issue. I mean, part of availing yourself of a market is how do they feel about you, and are they willing to buy things from you, and so forth. And so there's an economic bent to this as well.
From an investment perspective, Dr. Fox, one of the things that I think about when I heard you talk about that just now is, we look at the tremendous economic growth in the United States in the 1900s. And for much of that century, we were really an emerging market. And we're not an emerging market now, right? In some of these other areas in the world you're discussing. So to me, there's investment implications in terms of our assumptions of how we invest and where we invest and what our expectations are. What would you say about that?
Yeah, well, I'm not an investment advisor, so let me be really clear about that.
Yes, sir.
And so that's not where I operate. But again, the economic growth has been in recent years and will continue to be faster in many of the emerging markets, and again in China itself, in Asia more broadly than in the U.S. And so, to the extent that influences your investment decisions, then that's where the growth's going to be.
Yeah. Well, and there's certainly U.S. companies. I mean, many U.S. companies see more of their growth overseas as well. So there are a lot of ways to invest in companies that are expanding all over the world.
No, that's exactly right. Our multinationals, are surely in many cases seeing much faster growth outside of the U.S. than they're seeing in the U.S. And in part because they start in the U.S. and they develop the market here, and then they broaden it. Of course, to the extent you've already gotten a mature market inside the U.S., then your growth is going to be outside the U.S. But the population and the incomes are growing much faster outside the U.S. Again, I'm not saying every country. That's not my point. It's that in aggregate, we're going to find Africa and Asia, in the reverse order, Asia and Africa, as faster growing going forward.
Now let's talk about energy. Certainly, it's been on our minds this week with the pipeline shutdown. But there's the energy industry in the next decade, the innovation with alternatives. What are some of the things that you look for in the energy and renewable energy fields in the coming decade?
Yeah, I think it's really important for everybody to remember what you just said, and that is, don't think about how energy will be over the next decade by looking at where we are today, because innovation is a big part of the story of how it will develop. And if you think of batteries, for example, I think of electric cars. I've written a lot about autonomous vehicles and how they will influence the economy, and they, in my view, will be electric. And, the development of batteries, they're effectively 80-90% better than they were less than a decade ago. Longer life, cheaper, the whole range. And we'll continue to see alternative energy sources develop. They will become cheaper as they grow in scale. And so I do think we will see a shifting away from fossil fuels and towards alternative energy sources going forward. And so there's a lot of discussion about the environmental part. And again, I don't bring any environmental expertise to the table for the discussion. There are a lot of people who believe that's where we need to go from an environmental perspective. But it also will make, I think, good economic sense. And autonomous electric vehicles will actually make lots of sense, because and so again, that means moving away from fossil fuels. That will take decades for this to take place, because we have something like 250 million light vehicles on the roads or in the garages or in the parking lots in the U.S. today, that they don't go away immediately, and so this will be a slow pattern as it develops, but the autonomous vehicles will be owned in fleets as a general rule, not by individuals. If I have a vehicle that takes me wherever I want to go, leaves me and goes away, why do I need to own that? And, today's vehicles, of course, because we all have to be in them and moving them ourselves, then the average car is getting driven, an hour or so a day. But the vehicles could be driven 20 hours a day. And so if I, purchase not a car, but mobility from a fleet, then I can not purchase the whole car to have it sit most of the time in my driveway or at work, but instead I can buy the mobility when I need it of a vehicle that's used, 15, 20 times more. And then, the maintenance will work out easier and all the rest. And even the electric part of this gets easier, because if you have a fleet, keeping it, the ones needed charged all the time is a non-issue. It's just an issue for me as an individual when I have only one of them. A fleet of one doesn't work as well as a fleet of 1,000. And so, again, the technologies, not only in the energy area, but in the mobility area, will cause continued movement in how we get energy.
It's going to be really interesting to see it evolve. I do want to finally ask you about the discussions in Washington of raising the minimum wage. They're talking about $15 an hour. I want to ask you two questions here. How likely is a minimum wage increase? And do you think it'll be $15? And then the other question I want to ask you about that, just because it's a pet peeve, it just rankles me. I don't understand why the minimum wage in East Tennessee would be the same as the minimum wage in New York City or Los Angeles, California. So can you touch on both of those issues, please?
Well, let's talk about the second issue first, and that is the geography of this. And by the way, should the minimum wage, just to suppose there is one, be the same in Nashville, Tennessee, that it is in Morgan County, Tennessee? You don't have to compare ourselves with New York to say, hey, a minimum wage may have, at whatever level, may have much less impact in Nashville than it does in many rural Tennessee counties. And so a one-size-fits-all approach to minimum wages is certainly going to have very differential effects across the economy. So no question about that. And of course, then the challenge is, okay, suppose we agree that minimum wages should be different across geography, then how do we set that? And so it's clearly a big challenge, but the impacts are much bigger in lower wage areas for a fixed minimum wage. No question about that.
Well, and doesn't this ultimately, Dr. Fox, come back to that balance between open market forces determining a wage and then how much government regulation should there be in that?
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, of course, there's government regulation all through our economy, right? So let's recognize that. If we said, well, we're not going to have any government regulation in the labor markets, but you and I want government regulation in the quality of our food. We want regulation in the quality of our health care. We want government regulation in certain aspects of mobility on the roads and so forth. So let's not act like there's no government regulation. It exists all through our economy, and it wouldn't be unique to have it in the labor markets, and indeed in the labor markets we have it, an unemployment insurance system that everybody is required to be a part of, and so forth. So again, we have government regulation. The question is, what's an appropriate amount of regulation? And the minimum wage is, I mean, whether it passes Congress, that's a political question, not an economic one. I would think it would be hard to get much bipartisan agreement on a significant increase in the minimum wage. That would be my personal guess, looking at the politics of this. But the thing about minimum wages is, the conversation, at least to those who are proponents, focuses on a living wage. At least that's what I usually hear. But of course, living wage is only a part of this question, because many of the people who would be affected by minimum wages, in fact, you talked about I think you said 3 daughters earlier, and at least 2 of those are high school or college age, and they may be working in jobs that would be affected by the minimum wage. And so, is that the same concern we have to make sure that your daughters can make more money when they're 16 and 18 and 19 years old? And they're not trying to get a living wage. And obviously they want as much money as they can get, but it's not the same crisis as a household that's trying to live on $10 an hour. And so it's so many of the jobs and so much of the income associated with raising minimum wages goes to households that are middle income or upper middle income, and their teenagers and others are working in it. And so the economics and the equality issues are, sort of confused here a bit. Obviously, if we raise the minimum wage, then what will happen is some people won't get hired, and the people with the lowest skills are in that set. So that could be young people, some young people who've never had a job, but it also could be somewhat older people who simply are not very skilled, and they get priced out of the market. And of course, what's already happening in our economy, and COVID rapidly accelerated it, is technology replacing workers on redundant tasks. Mm-hmm. And many of these low wage jobs that could be affected by a minimum wage are redundant tasks. And so if the minimum wage gets raised very much, you'll just accelerate a pattern that's already underway. I've used this example before. Going through a McDonald's a year or so ago, the drive-through, and watching them fill my Coca-Cola. This was done by a machine. This wasn't done by a person. I was doing a drive-through, or whatever drink I was getting, and I mean, already you see the technology. This particular place, there was just maybe two workers in the back end of the store. Nobody inside, nobody buying inside. Two workers in the back end, and technology doing a lot of the work. And so even in, and of course there have been the kiosks that have been adopted. I'm just giving examples that what happens in the front end of grocery stores now, where we check out with our own behavior. Again, a lot of this is technology replacing workers. And so the real fear is that jobs go down as more technology takes place. And so it is a very complicated issue of making sure that people do have the income they need to live, but while recognizing an awful lot of minimum wages jobs don't go to them. And there will be some job losses with higher wages. Very tough balancing act.
Dr. Bill Fox, it's always so great to talk to you. I know that you need to go, so we appreciate it very much, taking time out of your busy schedule. Thank you, and we'll look forward to having you on down the road.
All right. Good talking to you.
Yes, sir. You too. That's economist Dr. Bill Fox. If you missed part of that, you can catch it again at 3 this afternoon. We'll also have it up on our website as a podcast. Click on radio at broganfinancial.com, and you can listen to the entire interview. When we come back, I'm going to talk about, in my dollars and cents segment, some of the more overlooked areas of what a retirement plan should look like. We all think about things like, how should we be investing our money? And maybe even when should we draw Social Security? But what are some of the real overlooked areas in retirement planning? So stay with us. This is More Living with Jim Brogan here on News Talk 98.7 WOKI.
Welcome back to News Talk 98.7's Brogan Financial Studios, where Jim Brogan is coming to you live with important news and advice to help you achieve your dream retirement. Get ready to learn and live. Here's your host, Jim Brogan.
Thank you for tuning in. We're on every Saturday at 9 a.m. and again at 3 p.m. here at More Living with Jim Brogan on News Talk 98.7 WOKI. A great interview with Dr. Bill Fox. If you missed part of that, do catch it this afternoon at 3, or you can go online to broganfinancial.com. It is time now for Dollars and Cents.
Want to be sure you are getting the most out of your retirement? For all the years of your retirement? That's the primary goal of More Living with Jim Brogan and our Dollars and Cents segment, where we provide you with an important financial tip that will help positively impact the quality of your life in retirement. And now, here's Jim with this week's Dollars and Cents tip.
Today I'd like to discuss 3 overlooked areas of retirement planning that are absolutely critical, in my view, to your long-term success in retirement. Number 1 would be understanding the impact of the timing of market returns. When we're saving and accumulating money, it's just not as important in terms of when are the good years and when are the bad years. Because over time, the stock market does well. In retirement, that completely gets flipped. And the timing of the good years and the bad years becomes critical, potentially. And the problem is we don't have any control of our market timing. How good are the markets the first 5 to 10 years of retirement? Yet those first 5 to 10 years have a disproportional effect on your long-term success. Much more important than what happens in year 15 to 20, as an example. So understanding that implication and understanding how to create a plan around that so you're not affected by your market timing when you retire. Is it a good market? Number 2 is structuring your income plan, which is really tied in directly to market timing. What if the markets are down in the early years of retirement? You don't want to be selling off investments and spending that money while they're down, because you'll compound your losses and that money will never, ever come back because you've spent it. See, it's okay to sell it when it's down and reinvest, but you never want to sell it and spend it. So structuring an income plan that doesn't depend on stock market gains or losses in the short term is critical. And then number 3, your tax plan. In my view, tax planning in the future is going to become more and more important, and the good news is you have more control of over your income taxes in retirement than in any other time of your life. Our income taxes are the largest expense you and I will ever have in our lifetimes, for most of us, and you need a good income plan which looks forward, not tax preparation that we do every year in the spring, but a forward-looking tax plan where we're intentional about our taxes. Unfortunately, that's it for this week. Thank you for tuning in. You can check us out at broganfinancial.com. You can subscribe to our e-newsletter. You can also sign up, if you'd like, for a complimentary consultation about your financial and retirement planning. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you to Chris engineering the show. Thank you, Jill, producing the show. This is More Living with Jim Brogan on News Talk 98.7 WOKI.
The views expressed by Jim Brogan and his guests are not that of Cumulus Media. Any discussion of financial, legal, and tax planning strategies is not intended to be individualized advice and is general in nature. Always consult with your advisor for advice specific to your needs. This program's content does not represent a recommendation of any particular security, strategy, or investment by Jim Brogan or Brogan Financial Incorporated.